Hey, what's up, everybody? You're listening to the Enterprise Architecture Radio. If you're thinking about organizational complexity and agility, if you're concerned about operational efficiencies and thinking of taking it to the next level, if managing innovation is one of your priorities, you've come to the right place. On this podcast, we talk about all of that and more. It's a jungle out there, and we'll attempt to navigate this jungle of frameworks, methods, and most importantly, enterprise architecture in practice. This is the 20th episode of Enterprise Architecture Radio. It feels like it's just been a few days, but it's actually been more than 3 months now. And we've been getting some good responses from the listeners of the podcast. It's also almost the end of the year, so I thought I would thank all my listeners of this podcast for listening to this, for sharing this with their peers and friends and colleagues and whoever would find this podcast interesting. I hope you find this content practical, and I would really like it if you would share your feedback with us. I've been getting some responses from some of my listeners, and there's one question that came up recently as to how would I interview an enterprise architect. While I was thinking about this, I started thinking, what is an enterprise architect after all? If I were to interview an enterprise architect, the first thing that I would look at is what would be the job description of an enterprise architect. And I've seen a few job descriptions in the last couple of days, and if you really ask me, the job descriptions felt like they were looking for Superman. They wanted the enterprise architect to know technologies. They wanted them to be an expert on infrastructure. They wanted the enterprise architect to be a good leader and a good people manager and everything. Now, is that what an enterprise architect is? Is it even possible for one person to be an expert in technology, in programming, in project management, in application development, in agile, in DevOps, in security architecture, and in leadership, a good communicator, a good stakeholder manager, and everything? I think not. An enterprise architecture capability is not one person. It is a group of people. It's a team effort. There are database architects, there are business architects, there are application architects, there are technology architects, there are security architects, there are cloud architects, there are programmers, there are project managers, there are agile experts, there are lean experts, and so on and so forth. And TOGAF has a beautiful skills framework that defines what the different roles are within an enterprise architecture capability, what are the skills required by each role, and what is the proficiency level of each role in each skill. It's something to really look at. For example, there could be generic skills such as leadership, teamwork, interpersonal, oral communication skills, written communication skills, and so on and so forth. And then there are business skills and methods such as business case, business scenario, business processes, strategic planning, etc. And then, of course, there are enterprise architecture skills such as business modeling, business process design, role design, organization design, etc. And there are project management and program management skills. And then you have IT specific skills. It could be infrastructure or programming or integration or asset management or various other technical skills. And then you could have other business-related skills like legal skills, skills around contract law, data protection law, and so on. And it's not expected that every single team member of the enterprise architecture capability be an expert in every single skill. For example, an architecture board member needs to be an expert in leadership and communication and so on. A database architect needs to be an expert in, database architecture and database design and so on. But he doesn't need to be an expert in leadership. An analyst, for example, doesn't need to be an expert in leadership skills, but he definitely requires an expert level analysis skills and so on and so forth. So you pick and choose what your expertise level is, and then based on that, you need to have proficiency in specific skills. That doesn't mean you can't know anything about enterprise architecture. I mean, everybody needs to have some basic understanding of enterprise architecture and design, but you don't need to be an expert in everything. Which brings me to a very interesting point. What is an enterprise architect? Is it really a title? Now, I am not an enterprise architect by title, all right? I started as an infrastructure architect in my current organization, but I would like to think that I am an enterprise architect because I have the enterprise architecture mindset. What differentiates an enterprise architect from any other IT professional is the perspective. A programmer, if not in an enterprise architecture capability, would focus on programming, would focus on the application that he or she is developing, and even have a business perspective from the point of view how the application that they are developing contributes to the business overall, what the business requirements are, and so on. But it still is a very, very vertical perspective. An enterprise architecture perspective, on the other hand, would be a very horizontal perspective. There is a saying, Jack of all trades, master of none. Now, this saying is perceived to be a negative trait. Being a jack of all trades and master of none is seen to be a bad thing. But interestingly, this saying is not complete. The complete saying is, jack of all trades, master of none, oftentimes better than master of one. What that means is, knowing a little bit about everything is better than knowing everything about one thing. An enterprise architect's role is something like that. An enterprise architect knows little about everything, but is not really an expert on one thing. He may or may not have been an expert in one thing at some point in time before he became an enterprise architect. But now that he's an enterprise architect, he doesn't look at one thing only. The idea is to have a perspective of a town planner instead of a construction architect. A construction architect looks at just one building. Of course, he has a lot more detail, as in how many floors is the building going to have, how many elevators, how the passageway is connected to each part of the building, to the extent of knowing what color the walls are going to be, where the furniture is going to be, what is the layout of the building, and so on and so forth. A town planner, on the other hand, may not know everything about every single building in the town, but he needs to know how the town is laid out, how the buildings are going to be laid out, and he needs to set up standards around how the sanitation is going to be and how the roads are going to be laid out and how far the building needs to be from the main roads and what have you. When an IT professional has this horizontal perspective, when an IT professional looks at the entire business and thinks about how the business is organized, what capabilities the business has, what IT capabilities the business has, and how these IT capabilities support the business overall. What are the different applications that are there? Which businesses do these applications support? How the data flows through the systems? And what are the different technologies and the technology platforms that support these applications and data? They are an enterprise architect. Another question that arises is, how much experience do you need to become an enterprise architect? And there is a common belief that an enterprise architect has to have at least 8 to 10 years of experience in the IT industry. Now, I'm not going to say that this belief is entirely wrong. Of course, it helps if you have 8 to 10 years of experience in the IT industry, because then you would have seen different aspects about the IT industry. You probably would have worked in a few consulting organizations, a few software product organizations, probably in the core businesses like finance, pharma, banking, etc. And that helps because you've seen different kinds of worlds, different kinds of applications of technologies and so on. You may have seen the application development world. You might have even some experience in the infrastructure world or the security world and so on. And that helps quite a bit because, again, it's a horizontal perspective. So the more experience you have in different diverse aspects of IT, the better it is. But does that mean that you can't start your career being an enterprise architect? Not necessarily. In one of my previous organizations, I had someone in my team who was hired as an intern or immediately after college. He was a campus hire, and he was an enterprise architect. There are two aspects of the enterprise architecture work. One is what I call the grind. The grind is the physical work that an enterprise architect needs to do, which is, when brought down to the absolute basics, collection of data. You collect information about the enterprise. You find out how many applications there are, how many business functions there are, how many business services each function has, how many organizations there are, which organization contains which business function. You look at all the different applications that exist and that support these business functions and these organizations. You collect data about information that is being managed by these applications for different business functions and so on. What is the technology platform? What are the software products that we are using to support these applications, such as virtualization or public cloud or what have you? What are the different services within the public cloud that essentially support these applications and data and so on? And this is absolute core gathering of data. And this is what I call the grind. And every single IT professional needs to go through this grind of, whether if you're a programmer, then you'd have to go through the grind of practicing programming languages and learning them. If you're a database professional, you would need to practice database querying and database design and so on. If you're a security architect, you will need to practice the security tools and understanding the security protocols and so on and so forth. Similarly, enterprise architecture also has as grind work. And this is not fun. The initial part of your career, it takes quite a lot of work to go through the grind. And the other part of enterprise architecture work is the intelligent stuff, the leadership work, the work where you manage stakeholders, where you try to understand what the stakeholder requirements are, what your organizational goals and objectives are, what your leaders want your IT organization to be doing, and then creating the business intelligence out of the information that is being gathered by the people who are going through the grind. Collecting all this information, storing it into an architecture repository, and then being able to create perspectives out of this data that we collect as enterprise architects. That is the intelligent stuff. And of course, to be able to do the intelligent stuff, you need a good amount of experience, because you need gravitas, you need the leadership skills to be able to manage stakeholders as to who your powerful and influential stakeholders are, and to manage their expectations and be able to deliver results. So yes, you can be an enterprise architect at the beginning of your career as well, if you choose to do so, although that's not very common. Usually people stumble upon enterprise architecture after a considerable amount of experience throughout their career. But if you were to decide that you want to start as an enterprise architect, it is not impossible. So ultimately it boils down to, what questions would you ask a candidate enterprise architect? It would depend on what the job description is. If you're hiring an experienced enterprise architect, you would want to know how diverse his experience is. If he has worked in different organizations, if he's worked in different areas of information technology, if he's worked on understanding the business, managing stakeholders, and so on and so forth. And you would want to see if he has a horizontal perspective, if he has an understanding of organizational objectives and what the stakeholders want, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to obviously tell you exactly what question it's going to be, but you understand. A candidate would want to try to focus on keeping their answers such that they demonstrate the diversity of their knowledge, the diversity of their experience, their big picture perspective about enterprises that they've worked for and how the business functioned and how the IT organization enabled the business function. They would want to show how they drove value as an enterprise architect or as an IT professional. And one important thing that I would look at is how they demonstrated value through reporting. How did they report their enterprise architecture work or their IT work to the business leaders so that the business leaders could see the value of their work? Other than that, I think if you're listening to this podcast because you are going to be applying for an enterprise architecture role, or if you are an aspirant of the enterprise architecture work, then the one piece of advice that I'll give you is instead of looking at enterprise architecture as a title, try to look at enterprise architecture as a mindset, as a role. No matter which title you go into, whether you are a database architect or a technology architect or managing a security architecture team or what have you, try to expand your focus to the entire organization and see how your capabilities and your team or your work drives value to the entire organization, and bring in an outside-in perspective, and I think you'll do well. I wish you all the best, and I wish all my listeners a happy holidays, and I hope you enjoy yourself during the Christmas holidays and the New Year. And my season's greetings and have fun, everyone. That's all I have for you today, folks. I hope you enjoyed the show. More about organizational agility, innovation, and enterprise architecture in the practical world, in the business, right here on the show. But before I end the show, I want you to help me out with this one little thing. Pause the show and share this podcast via WhatsApp or text message with at least one person who might be interested in the show. It could be anyone, your colleague, your boss, someone in your team. That's all I ask. Just one share with one message via text or WhatsApp or any social media of your choice, and it would go a long way in supporting this podcast and growing its listener base. Also, please don't forget to follow the podcast. That way, you will get notified when we publish a new episode. If you want to find out more about us, you can find us at enterprisearchitectureradio.com. If you have any ideas, thoughts, disagreements, please feel free to write to me directly. We also have a Telegram group if you would like to contribute to EA discussions or what have you. Just search for Enterprise Architecture Radio on Telegram, or the URL to join the group is https://t.me/Enterprise Architecture Radio. While our contact details are there in the show notes, we are very easy to find. Just search for Enterprise Architecture Radio anywhere. Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, even Discord. Although I just got started with Discord and don't know how to use it very well, but nevertheless. Once again, I hope you had fun, and I'll see you in the next one.